Sean Diddy Combs masqueraded as a hip-hop god with a billionaire empire, but behind the tailored suits, he was a sexual predator running one of the most depraved trafficking rings in history. He weaponized his unimaginable power, using drugs like GHB to force victims into multi-day freak-offs, leaving them so depleted they required IV fluids to survive. The truly sickening part? The entertainment elite smelled the baby oil and saw the broken bodies, yet chose absolute silence just to profit from his empire. Now, locked in a federal cell without bail, the horrifying, unvarnished truth of Diddy's collapse is finally exposed. The public exterior of absolute, unyielding corporate success is often the most effective camouflage for profound systemic human depravity. For over 3 decades, the global entertainment industry, the mainstream media, and millions of consumers elevated a single man to the status of a cultural deity, celebrating Sean John Combs as the ultimate embodiment of the American dream. He was the grinning, champagne-toasting billionaire who defined the aspirational, wealth-obsessed culture of hip-hop from the early 1990s straight through the 2000s. He was photographed on red carpets. He commanded the covers of prestigious financial magazines, and he was universally credited with launching the careers of global superstars, dictating the cultural conversation through his massive empire at Bad Boy Records. The era he dominated was characterized by the aggressive glorification of extreme, unrestrained hedonism, where limitless wealth, sprawling mansions, and endless luxurious parties were sold to the public as the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, yet entirely concealed beneath this glittering, highly marketed veneer of generosity and unstoppable ambition. A sickening, highly organized system of human exploitation was operating with terrifying cold-blooded efficiency. He was not merely a wealthy executive enjoying the company of willing participants in a fast-paced industry. He was a ruthless, calculating manipulator driven by a severe pathological need to assert total physical and psychological control over the vulnerable individuals drawn into his massive orbit. The chilling reality exposed by federal investigators and countless victim testimonies reveals a man who actively warped the genuine aspirations of young, desperate artists, transforming their dreams of musical success into a terrifying, inescapable nightmare of chemical dependency and sexual subjugation. His method of manipulation was a masterclass in psychological abuse specifically designed to strip his targets of their autonomy, their self-worth, and their physical freedom before they even realized the trap had been sprung. He deliberately and systematically targeted young, highly ambitious, and financially vulnerable individuals who arrived in Los Angeles or New York City possessing massive talent but absolutely no financial safety net. These young men and women viewed him as the ultimate gatekeeper, the singular entity who held the key to their entire future. He did not initially present himself as a predator. He approached them wearing the comforting disguise of a paternal savior and a generous mentor. The grooming process began not with physical force, but with the overwhelming, paralyzing application of immense wealth. He would aggressively insert himself into the most intimate details of their daily lives, paying their exorbitant monthly rent, purchasing luxury vehicles outright, funding their studio time, and handing over thousands of dollars in cash for shopping sprees. This calculated, overwhelming generosity was absolutely never a gift. It was a deeply sinister, meticulously planned investment designed to create absolute paralyzing financial dependency. He essentially purchased their entire physical reality, weaving a golden web that cut them off from their previous support systems. Once the victim was entirely reliant upon his bank accounts for their basic daily survival, the insidious demands for total compliance would begin. The relationship rapidly mutated from professional mentorship into a dark, highly controlling dictatorship where the victim's physical body was considered corporate property. When the inevitable, terrifying physical and emotional abuse occurred, the victims found themselves entirely trapped in a vicious, highly documented cycle. The brutal beatings and the degrading demands were immediately followed by lavish apologies, tearful promises of change, and massive financial rewards, such as expensive diamond jewelry or sudden career advancements. Clinical psychologists accurately identify this specific, highly destructive dynamic as trauma bonding. It is a severe, almost unbreakable psychological tether that binds the abused directly to the abuser. The victim's brain is chemically conditioned to associate the perpetrator of the violence with the ultimate source of comfort and financial survival, making it nearly impossible for them to simply walk away, contact their families, or report the escalating crimes to the authorities. They were completely isolated inside a multi-million-dollar prison, entirely dependent on the very man who was actively destroying their humanity. The absolute horrifying core of this exploitative empire, the darkest secret guarded by the entire music industry, manifested in what he internally and casually referred to as freak-offs. The global public had been conditioned to view his gatherings as legendary, star-studded Hollywood parties, but the reality occurring behind the heavily secured locked doors of his private hotel suites was a landscape of unspeakable horror. These events were not parties in any traditional recognizable sense. They were highly organized, heavily funded, non-consensual sexual marathons that frequently lasted for several consecutive days without a single pause. He utilized a massive, terrifying supply of synthetic narcotics to systematically dismantle the physical resistance, the moral boundaries, and the cognitive awareness of his victims. He would force young men and women to remain awake for incredibly prolonged periods, sometimes nearing 24 to 48 hours, completely saturating their central nervous systems with heavy chemical stimulants, designer drugs, and powerful tranquilizers. The environments where these atrocities took place were meticulously and chillingly prepared in advance by his vast network of corporate staff. The hotel rooms were transformed into sensory-deprived torture chambers, decorated with specific disorienting lighting filled with burning candles to mask the scent of the chemicals, and stocked with an industrial, almost incomprehensible quantity of commercial lubricants. The victims, heavily drugged, severely sleep-deprived, and entirely disoriented, were completely stripped of their agency. They were then coerced, threatened, and physically forced into performing extreme, degrading sexual acts with commercial male sex workers who had been specifically hired, flown across the country, and directed by the billionaire mogul for this exact sickening purpose. The room was devoid of any genuine pleasure, intimacy, or human connection. It was a heavily financed chemical slaughterhouse designed to completely shatter the human dignity of everyone trapped inside, reducing vibrant, ambitious individuals to mere biological props utilized for his own twisted entertainment. The physical toll on the human body during these prolonged, chemically fueled endurance tests was so severe that victims frequently required the administration of intravenous fluids immediately afterward just to recover from the massive dehydration and physical trauma. The most deeply disturbing, entirely pathological element of these prolonged multi-day assaults was the specific, highly deviant role the orchestrator carved out for himself within the room. He rarely participated directly in the physical acts of sexual violence he funded and directed. Instead, he operated entirely as a dominant voyeur, deriving a sickening, sociopathic gratification from standing safely in the shadows and watching the complete humiliating subjugation of others. He would observe the orchestrated chaos, actively masturbating while his heavily drugged victims were forced to engage with the hired sex workers. This severe voyeurism reached levels of absolute terrifying absurdity, perfectly highlighting the deep psychological rot sitting at the very center of his unimaginable wealth. A male commercial sex worker who was frequently hired and transported for these specific events later provided a chilling sworn legal testimony detailing a specific, highly disturbing incident that completely shatters the carefully curated public image of the hip-hop titan. The witness recounted seeing the billionaire music mogul enter the dimly lit, chemically saturated hotel room completely naked, wearing absolutely nothing but a traditional Islamic hijab wrapped tightly around his head, while firmly gripping a large commercial bottle of Astroglide lubricant. This is the grotesque, chilling truth operating silently behind the tailored designer suits, the prestigious award show speeches, and the massive philanthropic donations. He was a man completely consumed by his own untreated, escalating sexual deviance, utilizing his vast fortune to construct an environment where his darkest, most degrading fantasies could be acted out upon non-consenting human bodies. Furthermore, these horrifying displays of absolute dominance were never allowed to be private, fleeting moments. He meticulously and secretly recorded these extreme drug-fueled encounters, utilizing a network of hidden cameras strategically placed throughout the hotel suites and his private mansions. He was actively, methodically building a massive, highly classified video library documenting the total degradation of his peers, his employees, and his romantic partners. He utilized these hidden, explicit recordings as the ultimate insurmountable mechanism of absolute control. He silently and continuously held the highly damaging footage over the heads of his victims, weaponizing their own trauma against them to ensure their permanent silence, their continued participation, and their total unwavering obedience to his commands. The victims knew that if they ever attempted to speak out or escape the cycle of abuse, the footage of their most vulnerable, heavily drugged moments would be instantly leaked to the global media, permanently destroying their careers, their reputations, and their personal lives. To maintain this sprawling, highly illegal operation and prevent any victim, associate, or eyewitness from ever exposing the devastating truth to the public or law enforcement, he relied upon an atmosphere of absolute, terrifying, and unpredictable physical violence. The psychological manipulation, the financial entrapment, and the massive archive of blackmail material were aggressively backed up by a very real, well-documented history of brutal, swift retaliation against anyone who dared to defy his authority or threaten the stability of his empire. He did not operate like a standard corporate executive. He operated with the ruthless, unchecked aggression of a cartel boss. When a young associate or a romantic partner attempted to challenge his control or establish their own independence, the issue was never resolved through standard negotiation or professional separation. In one horrifying, heavily documented instance, to send an absolute, undeniable message of dominance, he had an individual physically dragged to the edge of a high-rise apartment and dangled precariously over the balcony. This was an act of sheer, terrifying intimidation, specifically designed to demonstrate to the entire room that he held the absolute power of life and death in his hands, and that the standard laws governing human behavior simply did not apply to him. His capacity for extreme violence was completely unchecked by the surrounding industry, which actively looked the other way. When he perceived that the prominent, highly successful hip-hop artist Kid Cudi had crossed him by showing romantic interest in someone he considered his own property, he did not engage in a public feud or a standard industry rivalry. He bypassed all normal avenues of conflict and directly ordered the total explosive destruction of the artist's vehicle. The car was completely incinerated in a targeted bombing, a devastating, highly dangerous act of domestic terrorism utilized entirely as a blunt, unmistakable warning. This was the true, terrifying nature of the power he wielded for decades. He ruled his massive, highly profitable empire through a calculated, lethal mixture of severe chemical subjugation, constant looming blackmail, and the ever-present, very real threat of explosive physical violence. The artists who signed to his label, the women who entered his romantic life, and the employees who facilitated his schedule were all forced to navigate a daily minefield of terror. He created a reality where compliance was the only path to survival, leaving behind a massive, silent, and deeply traumatized trail of shattered human lives, completely ruined careers, and broken minds, all while the rest of the world, the media, and the corporate boards continued to eagerly applaud his brilliant business acumen and purchase his heavily promoted products. The monster was never hiding in the shadows. He was standing directly in the spotlight, completely shielded by the blinding glare of a billion-dollar fortune, and an industry perfectly willing to sacrifice human beings for the sake of a hit record. The execution of a massive multi-state federal raid by heavily armed agents of Homeland Security investigations fundamentally shatters the carefully maintained illusion of untouchable celebrity power. When tactical units simultaneously breached the heavily fortified gates of his sprawling multi-million-dollar estates in the exclusive Holmby Hills neighborhood of Los Angeles and the highly restricted Star Island enclave in Miami, they did not simply uncover the excesses of a wealthy musician. They physically breached the heavily fortified barriers of his estates, exposing the central command centers of a highly organized transnational criminal syndicate, proving that the entire corporate structure was fundamentally and irreversibly compromised by his absolute depravity. The sheer scale of the logistical operation required to maintain his daily existence was entirely exposed, laying bare a terrifying infrastructure designed exclusively to facilitate, conceal, and sustain systemic human trafficking, severe chemical abuse, and extreme physical violence. The sprawling mansions, heavily featured in architectural magazines and music videos as the ultimate symbols of capitalist triumph, were instantly reclassified by federal authorities as active, sprawling crime scenes, holding the physical, undeniable evidence of decades of unchecked depravity. As federal agents systematically swept through the luxurious, meticulously decorated rooms of these estates, the physical evidence they collected painted a chilling portrait of a man completely consumed by violent paranoia and severe predatory compulsions. The initial discoveries were not merely illicit substances, they were military-grade weapons, stockpiled by a civilian, operating outside the boundaries of the law. Investigators located and seized multiple firearms, including fully assembled AR-15 semi-automatic rifles and a terrifying assortment of handguns. The most damning, chilling detail regarding this arsenal was the specific condition of the weaponry. The high-powered rifles were discovered with their serial numbers completely defaced and obliterated, a highly illegal modification utilized strictly by organized criminal networks to ensure the weapons cannot be traced back to the purchaser after being used in the commission of violent felonies. Furthermore, the handguns were found fully loaded with high-capacity magazines, actively prepped and ready for immediate, lethal deployment. He was not a standard celebrity employing private security for protection against overzealous fans. He was a deeply paranoid trafficker, hoarding untraceable firepower within his bedroom closets to violently enforce the strict, terrifying codes of silence among his victims, his staff, and his extensive network of enablers. The physical weaponry, however, was secondary to the massive, highly organized chemical arsenal discovered during the synchronized raids. The federal agents did not merely find standard recreational narcotics casually left on a coffee table. They uncovered a deeply sinister, carefully curated pharmacy of highly potent synthetic drugs explicitly utilized to completely disable the cognitive functions and physical resistance of human beings. These lethal chemicals were not stored in standard medical containers. They were deliberately and arrogantly transported and concealed within highly expensive designer Gucci luggage bags, perfectly illustrating the grotesque intersection of extreme luxury and severe criminality. Inside these high-end designer bags, investigators documented staggering quantities of narcotics, including massive commercial-grade bags of a highly potent, dangerous synthetic mixture known as pink cocaine, alongside heavily regulated animal tranquilizers like ketamine, which are specifically utilized to paralyze the central nervous system and induce severe dissociation in victims. Furthermore, the federal inventory explicitly detailed the discovery of small plastic baggies filled with a pure, white, powdery substance meticulously labeled by his staff as DBL wash, which subsequent chemical testing immediately confirmed to be high-grade cocaine. The most surreal, deeply disturbing manifestation of his complete detachment from reality was found in the massive quantities of MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy. These potent, heavily synthetic pills designed to artificially flood the human brain with serotonin and completely eradicate physical boundaries were specifically custom pressed into the exact facial likeness of former United States President Barack Obama. This bizarre, highly specific detail highlights a terrifying level of unchecked arrogance. He was a man who felt so completely, absolutely insulated from federal law enforcement that he was comfortably purchasing and distributing massive wholesale quantities of illegal narcotics specifically manufactured to mock the highest political office in the country, utilizing these exact pills to systematically destroy the neural pathways of the young, vulnerable artist trapped inside his hotel rooms. But the most chilling discovery wasn't the untraceable weapons or the custom-pressed narcotics. It was the terrifying logistics of the abuse itself. Federal agents seized over 1,000 bottles of baby oil, and commercial lubricants stockpiled across his mansions. This wasn't a personal preference. It was an industrial-scale inventory. It serves as a grim physical monument to the multi-day freak-offs, proving that the degradation of his victims was a heavily scheduled corporate-level operation. The execution of these highly complex multi-state sexual marathons could absolutely never be accomplished by a single individual, regardless of their immense wealth. To operate an illicit enterprise of this massive scale, he entirely co-opted his legitimate corporate infrastructure. Sean Combs Enterprises, a highly successful, globally recognized business entity with legitimate offices, human resource departments, and corporate tax structures, was actively, secretly functioning as a highly efficient, heavily funded criminal syndicate. The young, highly educated professionals he hired as executive assistants, travel coordinators, and security personnel were not merely managing a musician's demanding daily schedule. They were actively, knowingly employed as the primary logistical facilitators of a massive human trafficking ring. These corporate employees, drawing standard salaries and utilizing company credit cards, were the exact individuals tasked with the most degrading, highly illegal responsibilities. They were the ones making the encrypted phone calls to procure the massive quantities of ketamine and custom-pressed ecstasy. They were the ones actively coordinating the interstate flights, utilizing private aviation charters to illegally transport vulnerable, chemically dependent commercial sex workers across state lines to service his extreme, highly specific demands, a direct, undeniable violation of federal human trafficking statutes. This corporate complicity was most violently visible in the highly organized, standardized protocols utilized to secure the environments for the abuse. When the operation required absolute privacy, away from the heavily guarded mansions, the corporate staff would meticulously execute a complex booking strategy at some of the most exclusive, highly monitored luxury hotels in the world, utilizing aliases and shell corporations to mask the identity of the true occupant. His executive assistants would frequently book massive multi-room penthouse suites at prestigious establishments, including the Trump International Hotel in New York City, utilizing the specific established pseudonym Frank Black. Once the suite was secured under the false identity, the corporate staff would immediately transform the luxury accommodation into a highly functional, sensory-deprived execution chamber. They were strictly tasked with stocking the rooms with the required inventory of narcotics, setting up the specific lighting rigs, laying down the massive quantities of towels and sheets required to absorb the chemical and biological waste, and strategically positioning the hidden camera equipment utilized to capture the highly explicit, heavily leveraged blackmail footage. The final, most degrading responsibility forced upon the corporate payroll occurred in the agonizing, silent aftermath of the multi-day assaults. When the drugs finally wore off, when the hired sex workers were completely physically exhausted, and when the victims were lying severely dehydrated and deeply traumatized on the floor of the hotel suite, The executive assistants were ordered to enter the active crime scene. These employees, carrying company briefcases and operating entirely under his strict directives, would walk directly into hotel rooms heavily saturated with the thick, overwhelming stench of synthetic narcotics, commercial lubricants, and bodily fluids. Their explicit job was to execute the final stage of the criminal transaction. They would physically hand out massive, undocumented stacks of physical cash to the sex workers to ensure their immediate, absolute silence. They would frequently be required to coordinate emergency, off-the-books medical interventions, paying private, highly discreet medical professionals to arrive at the hotel and administer intravenous fluids to the victims who were actively suffering from severe, life-threatening dehydration and chemical exhaustion. Once the human collateral was finally cleared from the room, the staff was tasked with the absolute systematic erasure of the crime scene. They meticulously scrubbed the hotel suites, disposing of the empty chemical baggies, removing the hundreds of empty lubricant bottles, and aggressively destroying any physical evidence that could alert the hotel management or law enforcement to the extreme violence that had just occurred. They operated with the terrifying cold-blooded efficiency of a professional cleanup crew working for a heavily armed cartel. This was the stark, undeniable cost of doing business within the heavily guarded walls of his corporate empire. The individuals surrounding him traded their basic human morality and their legal safety for a steady paycheck and proximity to immense power, actively choosing to look the other way, fund the narcotics, and scrub the blood out of the carpets, proving that the entire corporate structure was fundamentally, irreversibly compromised by his absolute unchecked depravity. The inescapable nature of this nightmare was permanently cemented by the most terrifying tool in his arsenal: the systematic weaponization of shame. The physical violence and chemical subjugation were horrific, but they were often temporary states. The true permanent prison was constructed using digital media. The raids on his properties did not just uncover guns and drugs. They unearthed a sprawling, meticulously cataloged digital archive of the abuse itself. He was not merely a voyeur. He was an archivist of human degradation. Throughout his mansions and the rented hotel suites, hidden cameras were strategically embedded in the architecture. They were placed in bedrooms, bathrooms, and living areas, silently recording the chemically induced horrors occurring during the freak-offs. Victims, often entirely unaware they were being filmed, were captured in their most vulnerable, incapacitated, and humiliating moments. This was not a collection for personal gratification. It was a highly organized corporate blackmail vault. This vault is the Rosetta Stone for understanding why the silence surrounding his crimes held firm for over 3 decades. If a victim managed to sober up and found the courage to leave, or if a high-profile celebrity who had participated in the parties attempted to sever ties, the footage was deployed with lethal precision. He possessed the digital capability to instantly annihilate their careers, destroy their marriages, and obliterate their public reputations. In a culture obsessed with image and purity, releasing a video of an individual engaged in extreme drug-fueled sexual acts is a digital execution. He effectively held the entire entertainment industry hostage. Young artists who had been drugged and assaulted knew that reporting him to the police meant triggering their own public destruction. Established executives and A-list actors who had witnessed or participated in the depravity knew their complicity was recorded on hard drives, sitting in his safe. He didn't just buy silence with cash, he extorted it with terror. The existence of this vault created a culture of mutually assured destruction, ensuring that the most powerful people in Hollywood and the music industry were structurally bound to protect him, because allowing him to fall meant risking their own exposure. They weren't just protecting a billionaire, they were protecting the hard drives that held the keys to their own ruin. The absolute most terrifying dimension of this decades-long criminal enterprise was not simply the actions of a single deeply disturbed billionaire. It was the deafening, heavily orchestrated, and entirely deliberate silence of the global entertainment elite. The sprawling mansions in Miami and Los Angeles were not isolated fortresses operating in a vacuum. They were the central social hubs for the most powerful, influential figures in the music, film, and fashion industries. A continuous glittering parade of A-list celebrities, massive corporate executives, prominent politicians, and highly paid talent managers walked directly through the heavy wooden doors of those estates. These individuals willingly entered an environment heavily saturated with the suffocating, undeniable stench of synthetic narcotics, industrial lubricants, and human degradation. They stepped off their private jets, walked past the heavily armed security details, and entered VIP rooms where the horrific, non-consensual realities of the freak-offs were often bleeding directly into the peripheral vision of the so-called legitimate parties. The elites of the entertainment world saw the severely dehydrated, chemically incapacitated victims stumbling through the hallways. They witnessed the erratic, deeply violent behavior of the host. They observed the heavy, undeniable presence of commercial sex workers being actively trafficked through the properties. Yet, instead of initiating a massive federal intervention or publicly condemning the absolute destruction of human dignity occurring right in front of them, they simply adjusted their designer clothing, walked over the collateral damage, and eagerly clinked their champagne flutes. They actively chose to smile for the paparazzi cameras, enthusiastically toasting the very man who was methodically crushing the lives of the vulnerable individuals hidden just a few doors down. This widespread systemic complicity was anchored in a profound, deeply cynical, transactional morality that defines the highest echelons of the capitalist entertainment machine. The industry elite, record label presidents, executives, and media personalities knew about the dark underbelly of his empire. The stories of abuse and forced sexual marathons weren't secrets. They were persistent whispers echoing through boardrooms for 30 years. But Combs controlled the center of the hip-hop economy. He could make or break a career overnight. Faced with a choice, the people surrounding him performed a cold, calculated moral calculus. They decided his multi-million-dollar revenue was simply worth the human cost. They protected the predator because the predator was actively signing their paychecks, funding their lavish lifestyles, and providing them with direct, unfettered access to the absolute pinnacle of cultural power. To enforce this devastating wall of silence, he utilized a highly aggressive, heavily weaponized legal and public relations infrastructure. His corporate payroll included some of the most expensive, ruthless attorneys and crisis management specialists in the United States. Whenever a victim desperately attempted to break the silence, whenever a terrifying story of physical assault or sexual coercion threatened to leak to the mainstream press, this massive corporate defense mechanism would immediately activate. They ruthlessly utilized aggressive non-disclosure agreements, threatening victims with complete financial ruin if they dared to speak a single word about the horrors they had endured. The public relations teams actively manipulated the media narrative, trading exclusive celebrity access and highly lucrative interview opportunities to major publications in direct exchange for their absolute silence regarding the mounting allegations. The music industry press, fully aware of the violent reality, cowardly chose to look the other way, continuing to publish glowing, sycophantic profiles praising his philanthropic efforts and his brilliant business acumen while actively bearing the desperate pleas of the individuals he had shattered. He was entirely shielded by a massive, impenetrable dome of corporate complicity, a system that actively gaslit the victims, convincing them that absolutely no one in the world would ever believe a penniless, traumatized artist over a globally beloved, heavily protected billionaire. This toxic, seemingly invincible fortress of elite complicity and corporate protection finally, catastrophically shattered, not through a sudden awakening of industry morality, but through the undeniable explosive force of sheer, accumulated human trauma. The heavy, ironclad dam began to crack irreparably when the deeply ingrained culture of silence was directly challenged by the immense courage of those who had survived the absolute worst of his brutality. The initial terrifying whispers rapidly evolved into a deafening, unavoidable roar as the civil justice system became the battleground for the truth. The profound tipping point occurred when a cascade of detailed, horrifyingly consistent civil lawsuits began to systematically flood the federal courts, meticulously detailing the exact gruesome mechanics of his sexual trafficking ring, the forced narcotics consumption, and the severe physical beatings. The industry could no longer dismiss the allegations as isolated incidents or the fabrications of disgruntled former employees. A massive, unprecedented coalition of over 120 individual accusers simultaneously stepped forward, preparing a legal assault that entirely bypassed the corrupt, compromised gatekeepers of the music business. The sheer overwhelming volume of the testimonies detailing the exact same horrifying methods of chemical subjugation, the specific logistics of the hotel bookings, and the deeply disturbing voyeurism created a massive, undeniable evidentiary mountain that the corporate crisis managers could no longer bury or spin. The ultimate devastating blow that permanently annihilated his carefully curated public persona and completely stripped away the protection of the entertainment elite did not come from a written legal brief or a whispered rumor. It arrived in the form of cold, unblinking, and absolutely irrefutable digital evidence. The entire global public was suddenly confronted with a piece of internal security footage captured in 2016 from the highly exclusive Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles. This surveillance video instantly and violently tore away the grinning, benevolent mask of the billionaire mogul, exposing the terrifying, unhinged predator operating underneath. The silent, grainy footage provided a horrific, frame-by-frame documentation of absolute, unrestrained domestic terror. The video showed his then-girlfriend, the recording artist Cassie Ventura, desperately attempting to flee down the long, carpeted hotel hallway, carrying her bags, exhibiting the frantic, terrified body language of a captive attempting a desperate escape. Seconds later, the horrifying reality of his private behavior exploded onto the screen. He was captured sprinting down the hallway in aggressive pursuit, entirely unhinged, wearing absolutely nothing but a white towel wrapped around his waist. He violently grabbed her by the back of the neck, throwing her body forcefully and brutally to the ground. The footage did not show a standard argument. It documented a completely one-sided, savage physical assault. While she lay defenseless on the hotel floor, the globally celebrated music executive delivered a series of vicious, full-force kicks directly to her motionless body. The sheer casual brutality of the violence was staggering. He then coldly reached into her bags, retrieved a heavy glass vase, and aggressively hurled the object at her in a fit of uncontrollable predatory rage. Finally, displaying a terrifying absolute entitlement to her physical body, he grabbed her aggressively by the collar of her clothing and began to physically drag her limp body backward down the hallway, pulling her back toward the hotel room, effectively dragging her back into the very nightmare she had just attempted to escape. The release of this specific surveillance footage triggered a massive, instantaneous, and permanent cultural shockwave. It completely eradicated the decades of carefully manufactured public relations, instantly neutralizing the expensive legal defense teams and the sycophantic industry enablers. The global audience, the media, and the corporate sponsors were forced to watch in stark, undeniable high definition the exact monstrous behavior that the victims had been desperately reporting for decades. There was no possible misinterpretation of the visual evidence. It was the absolute unvarnished documentation of a predator utilizing extreme physical violence to maintain total control over a vulnerable human being. The sudden, overwhelming public exposure of his true nature triggered a massive, highly public exodus of the very elites who had spent decades drinking his champagne and protecting his empire. The politicians who had proudly accepted his massive campaign donations rapidly and publicly scrambled to return the funds. The prestigious universities that had eagerly accepted his charitable endowments completely severed ties, actively attempting to scrub his name from their buildings. The major corporate brands and television networks that had built lucrative partnerships with his holding company instantly terminated their contracts, frantically attempting to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of his exposed criminality. In a desperate, deeply pathetic attempt to salvage the rapidly disintegrating remnants of his legacy, he released a highly orchestrated, self-recorded apology video across his social media platforms, sitting in front of a camera, utilizing a somber tone and carefully rehearsed expressions of remorse. He publicly admitted to the violence captured on the hotel surveillance footage. However, this heavily manufactured display of contrition only served to further highlight the deep, irredeemable psychological rot at the core of his personality. In the entire duration of the public apology, he repeatedly centered his own feelings, his own supposed journey of healing, and his own personal struggles, completely failing to directly address the immense lifelong trauma he had inflicted upon the victim he had brutally kicked and dragged down that hallway. The apology was not a genuine expression of human remorse. It was a calculated, final, and entirely unsuccessful public relations maneuver executed by a narcissist who had suddenly realized that his billions of dollars could no longer purchase his immunity. The video served as the final absolute death knell for the untouchable billionaire persona. The man who had aggressively demanded absolute respect, who had utilized severe physical violence, massive financial extortion, and chemical subjugation to build a terrifying empire of fear, was entirely reduced to a universally despised, completely isolated pariah. The heavy ironclad gates of his sprawling mansions, which had once served as the ultimate symbol of his supreme corporate power, were now entirely surrounded by federal agents and investigative journalists. The music industry elite, the sycophantic executives, and the A-list celebrities who had willingly enabled his decades of horrific abuse completely vanished, retreating back into their own heavily guarded estates, leaving him entirely alone to face the catastrophic, inescapable consequences of his own monstrous actions. The impenetrable corporate fortress had completely collapsed, leaving nothing behind but the horrific, undeniable truth, setting the stage for the absolute final destruction of his physical freedom and the total liquidation of his blood-soaked legacy. The absolute sudden annihilation of a multi-billion-dollar reality is a profound psychological and physical trauma that completely shatters the human mind. For decades, Sean Combs existed within a meticulously constructed, heavily insulated universe where his every whim was an immediate command. His wealth operated as an impenetrable shield against all consequences, and his physical environment was strictly defined by unparalleled luxury. The transition from that state of absolute godlike control to the harsh, unforgiving concrete reality of the federal penal system occurred with terrifying, breathtaking velocity in the late hours of September 2024. When federal agents finally placed heavy steel handcuffs on his wrists in the lobby of a luxury Manhattan hotel, the invisible, powerful aura of the untouchable music mogul instantly evaporated. The private jets, the sprawling mansions on Star Island, and the heavily armed security details were entirely replaced by the cold, mechanical, and deeply isolating protocols of the United States Department of Justice. He was physically transported away from his empire and deposited directly into the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, a federal holding facility globally notorious for its bleak, dangerous, and severely austere conditions. The physical environment of this specific detention center serves as the ultimate unforgiving contrast to the life he violently maintained for himself and his victims. The man who obsessively controlled the lighting, the temperature, and the specific aesthetic of his sprawling estates now resides in a severely cramped, heavily monitored cell composed entirely of cinder block and reinforced steel. The luxurious silk sheets and custom-made mattresses have been completely replaced by a thin, highly uncomfortable institutional cot. The sprawling panoramic views of the Atlantic Ocean and the Los Angeles skyline have been violently reduced to a heavily barred, narrow slit of reinforced glass looking out onto the grim industrial landscape of Brooklyn. The massive, highly paid staff of executive assistants, private chefs, and personal security guards who previously catered to his every waking demand are entirely gone. They have been replaced by federal correctional officers who view him not as a brilliant cultural icon or a powerful billionaire, but strictly as another highly visible, high-risk federal inmate requiring constant surveillance. Every single aspect of his daily existence, when he wakes, when he eats the heavily processed institutional food, and when he is permitted to simply walk outside of his cell, is now completely dictated by the rigid, unyielding schedule of a government bureaucracy. He has been entirely stripped of the one thing he valued above all human life: absolute control. The desperate, highly publicized legal maneuvers executed by his defense team perfectly illustrate the profound, deeply pathetic realization that his immense wealth has finally lost its terrifying power. In a frantic attempt to purchase his physical freedom and escape the grim reality of the detention center, his attorneys presented the federal court with an unprecedented, astronomical bail package. They offered a staggering $50 million, offering to surrender the deed to his sprawling Miami mansion, demanding that he be placed under heavily monitored house arrest with continuous GPS tracking and a private security detail that he would personally fund. He essentially attempted to utilize the exact same financial tactics he used to silence his victims for decades, believing that a massive, overwhelming pile of money could simply buy the federal government's compliance. The presiding federal judge, however, looked directly at the massive, undeniable evidentiary record of his severe violence, the highly documented history of his aggressive witness tampering, and the profound ongoing danger he posed to the community, and delivered a ruling that completely shattered his universe. The judge explicitly and repeatedly denied his request for bail. For the very first time in his adult life, sitting in a sterile federal courtroom, wearing a standard-issue prison uniform, the billionaire mogul was confronted with an absolute, uncompromising denial that no amount of money, high-priced lawyers, or industry connections could ever reverse. While he sits heavily isolated in a Brooklyn jail cell, desperately awaiting a federal criminal trial that carries the very real possibility of a permanent life sentence, the massive, highly lucrative financial empire he spent 30 years building is being systematically, ruthlessly dismantled. The criminal indictment is merely the first wave of a catastrophic, multi-front legal assault that is actively liquidating his entire legacy. The heavy, ironclad dam of silence that he violently maintained for decades has completely burst, resulting in a staggering, unprecedented avalanche of civil litigation. A massive, highly organized coalition of over 120 individual accusers has stepped forward, filing a relentless barrage of detailed, horrifyingly consistent lawsuits, explicitly detailing severe sexual assault, forced narcotic consumption, and aggressive physical battery. These civil suits are not merely seeking public validation, they are executing a highly calculated financial strategy designed to systematically dismantle his billion-dollar empire. The teams of aggressive civil attorneys are meticulously targeting his corporate holding companies, his publishing catalogs, and his massive real estate portfolio, ensuring that the wealth he accumulated through the systemic exploitation of others is aggressively seized to compensate the individuals whose lives he completely shattered. The corporate reaction to this massive, highly public downfall exposes the absolute, chilling hypocrisy and the deep transactional cowardice of the global business community. The massive lifestyle brands, the prestigious television networks, and the global liquor conglomerates that eagerly partnered with his holding company for decades actively profiting from his highly marketed persona while completely ignoring the violent whispers surrounding his private life, have executed a brutal, instantaneous corporate erasure. The major vodka and tequila brands completely severed their highly lucrative partnerships, actively removing his image from their marketing materials overnight. The clothing lines he founded and the media networks he helped build forcefully and publicly distanced themselves, frantically attempting to scrub his name from their corporate histories to avoid the massive radioactive fallout of his exposed criminality. The people who eagerly sat in his VIP sections, drank his alcohol, and utilized his massive cultural influence to build their own careers, now look directly into television cameras and claim they had absolutely no idea what was happening behind those locked hotel doors. The entire commercial system that actively elevated him, protected him, and celebrated his toxic behavior simply detached him like a defective, heavily contaminated corporate asset, leaving him to face the total absolute ruin of his legacy entirely alone. The sprawling, horrific narrative of Sean Combs is not a triumphant story of musical genius, nor is it a standard cautionary tale about the fleeting nature of fame. It is a stark, highly clinical, and deeply terrifying autopsy of an entertainment industry that actively and willingly functions as a massive, highly profitable meat grinder. The system eagerly constructed a golden pedestal for a man suffering from severe, untreated psychological deviance because his aggressive, highly toxic behavior generated unprecedented quarterly revenue. They handed him the heavy diamond-encrusted crown of the hip-hop elite, completely validating his worst, most destructive impulses, and actively funded the massive logistical infrastructure required to operate his chemical slaughterhouses. They watched him methodically crush the dreams, the physical bodies, and the psychological stability of countless young, vulnerable human beings. And they collectively decided that the platinum records and the massive financial returns were entirely worth the human cost. They were perfectly willing to let the victims suffocate in the dark, just as long as the champagne continued to flow in the VIP rooms. There is a profound, inescapable finality to this level of absolute moral and systemic failure. The massive bank accounts, the historic music catalogs, and the decades of heavily curated public relations are entirely powerless to purchase a single ounce of human dignity or reverse the catastrophic destruction of his physical freedom. He has been entirely stripped of the terrifying power he wielded like a weapon, reduced to a heavily monitored inmate wearing institutional clothing, completely at the mercy of the very justice system he arrogantly believed he had permanently outsmarted. The culture will eventually move forward. The corporate executives will find a new, highly profitable artist to heavily market, and the massive, uncaring machine of the music industry will continue to operate without him. The ultimate devastating truth of his life is that he sacrificed his basic humanity, his freedom, and the lives of everyone around him simply to maintain an illusion of absolute control that evaporated the exact second the federal agents knocked on his door. He stands today as the ultimate horrifying monument to the absolute failure of wealth without morality. A man who built a massive, glittering kingdom entirely on the broken bones of the vulnerable, only to end up buried alive beneath the toxic, suffocating wreckage of his own monstrous design.